no witness ever managed to tell the whole story. By the time officials reached Blackwater House, the dogs were dead, the gate was blocked, the windows were broken, and the men who had ruled that land were hanging where every road hand could see them. The ledgers were ruined in mud, the rice flats were streaked with blood, and the few white survivors who later tried to describe what happened kept tripping over the same impossible fact. The people they had called obedient had not exploded into madness. They had moved with plan. Before we walk into that night, we have to go back to the first death, because the man they later turned into rumor was not born a ghost. He was born a son. Long before Blackwater House ever smelled his blood, a boy named Kofi lived inland from the great West African rivers, where mornings came up warm through raffia and red dust and wood smoke. He grew up in a village that measured men by patience more than noise. Hunters taught boys how to read broken grass, how to hear a branch moved by hands instead of wind, how to tell the difference between fear and caution in the way another person breathed. Kofi was never the loudest, never the strongest, never the first one to boast beside the fire. He was the boy who noticed who went quiet when traders arrived, the boy who remembered which footprint had a broken heel, the boy who could tell when an elder lied smiling. His father told him, "A man who listens lives twice." Then the raiders came before dawn. They came with local guides, rope, muskets, iron, and the hard efficiency of people who had done this before. The dogs barked first, then huts caught flame. Men ran out half awake and were clubbed flat in the yard. Women reaching for children were dragged through ash by their arms. One old hunter who refused to kneel had his skull split where he stood. Kofi saw his father drive a short spear through one raider's neck, and then vanish beneath rifle stocks and boots. He saw his mother once in the smoke, her wrapper bright against flame, one hand reaching for his younger sister. Then a blow cracked the back of his head, and the world went black. He woke tied to a forked pole among strangers. That was the first death. The second came at the coast, where the white fort sat above the sea like something built to digest grief. Its cells were stone, urine wet, crowded past language. Men from inland forests lay beside men from open savannas, Muslims beside spirit keepers, boys beside fathers, all reduced to the same iron rings in the wall. The traders inspected shoulders, teeth, thighs, and backs, the way buyers inspect draft animals. Kofi learned then that slavery was not merely labor stolen from the body. It was memory hunted on purpose. On the ship, that war became hell, made practical. The hold was too low to sit straight, too tight to turn, too foul to keep count of the smells. Waste ran under chained ankles. Fever took men by rows. Women were dragged above deck at night and returned bruised, bleeding, or emptied out into silence. Those who refused food had iron forced into their mouths. Those who fought were flayed until the bones in their backs showed white through red. Some jumped when the chance came, choosing shark water over another dawn in chains. Kofi tried to count the dead during the first weeks. By the end of the passage, he stopped. Numbers were too small. What remained was rhythm. An older captive chained 3 bodies away began tapping against the hull after dark, when the groaning softened and men started leaving themselves behind. Tap, pause, tap, tap. The code was simple enough to hide inside ship noise and sharp enough to carry meaning. Wait, watch, remember. The man's name, once they pieced enough words together between languages, was Abina Kwaku, though most on the plantation would later know him only as Ben. He had been a war drummer and messenger before his capture, a man who understood that rhythm can travel where speech cannot. Kofi answered by knocking twice on the beam above his shoulder. That was how the first oath between them was made, not with ceremony, with refusal. When they landed in the Lowcountry, The buyers renamed them before the mud on their ankles had dried. Kofi became Jacob on one list, Cuff on another, boy to most mouths that mattered, and nothing the white men said could alter how fiercely his true name stayed buried under his tongue. He was sold inland to a tidewater estate called Blackwater House, a rice and indigo property cut into marsh country where canals, dikes, mosquito water, and mud did as much killing as the whip. The master, Elias Vane, liked to say a good plantation should run like a clock. He meant every living person under him should move on command. Blackwater House sat on rich, wet ground in the Carolina Lowcountry, its big timber house raised above packed earth, its store sheds and smokehouse grouped around a yard scarred black from years of punishment fires. Beyond that spread the rice trunks and flooded fields, then indigo vats, then cypress dark where roads turned to swamp after rain. The first thing Kofi saw there was a whipping post polished by hands and blood. The second was a boy maybe 12 years old, being flogged until the skin across his shoulders opened in wet strips because he had dropped a water pail in the yard. No one cried out. That was what stunned him most. Not the violence itself, but the ordinary shape around it. Women kept walking. Men kept their eyes down. A cook crossed the yard with ashes. The overseer wiped his wrist and asked for the next task. At Blackwater, horror had become routine enough to wear work clothes. The quarters were low cabins of split plank, mud chinking, and smoke, lined in rows like tools put away after use. People rose before the bell because fear wakes earlier than metal. Mothers checked on fevered children in the dark. Old people coughed into blankets already damp from rot. Men with infected feet wrapped them in rags and went out anyway because illness was read as defiance, unless it turned into a corpse. Food was rationed to prolong labor, not life. Cornmeal, salt scrap, rice too poor to sell. Sometimes fish gone sweet at the edges. Pregnant women worked in water until they bled. Children too small for the fields were sent to haul, scrape, lift, fan fires, or keep insects off the sick. At night, the master's two sons, Nathaniel and Silas, moved through the quarters with lanterns and liquor, as if every black woman on the estate had been entered in their inheritance. Complaints brought beatings. Resistance brought sale, maiming, or a hole in the cypress edge where no marker stood. Kofi survived his first months by becoming the shape power overlooks. Quiet, useful, slow to anger in public, plain in posture. He let white men think his silence meant dullness. He nodded when commanded. He kept his eyes low. He made himself steady enough to be sent where a louder man would not. Fence repair after storms, sack carrying from storehouse to kitchen, patchwork on stable latches, hauling ledgers from office to porch, helping clear flooded tools after a levee broke. Piece by piece, he learned what the plantation believed was hidden, where Vane kept the extra shot and powder dry, which key opened the grain store, which key opened the side room where shackles and iron collars hung, how long the North Patrol took to circle the lower rice flats, which dog barked first and which dog bit first, how the night watch drank after rain, how the bookkeeper stepped behind the curing shed at the same time each evening and never carried his pistol there, how the bell rope above the yard had already begun to fray. He learned something even more valuable than roots. He learned the plantation's confidence. Blackwater House believed terror was enough. It believed fear had done all the thinking that needed doing. It believed men and women crushed by labor would be too fragmented by language, grief, and hunger to build anything harder than prayer. That was the blindness inside the whole system. Vane and his sons watched backs and wrists. They never learned to watch memory. Ben was there too, sold into Blackwater from a smaller river estate after surviving 2 failed escape attempts and a branding on his shoulder that had never managed to make him smaller. At night, when wind-covered sound and the cabins had quieted to breath and insects, he and Kofi would speak in fragments behind the last row of quarters, piecing a bridge between languages with gesture, repetition, and the stubborn intelligence of men who needed to be understood more than they needed to be elegant. Ben believed chains rot from the inside before they break in the open. Kofi believed men like Vane should be made to feel what they had built. Between those ideas, a design began. Not rebellion yet. Rebellion is the visible thing. This was colder than that. This was study. Women often saw what men in the fields could not, and at Blackwater House, the first true courier of the plan was a woman named Amma. She worked wash and hallway service in the main house, moving through rooms where white men spoke freely because they had mistaken nearness for invisibility. Amma knew which son slept alone when drunk, which floorboard in the pantry cried out under weight, and which guest chambers were used when traders came from Charlestown. She also knew exactly how many girls had come out of those hallways bleeding. When Kofi finally let her see the shape of what he was becoming, she did not ask whether he meant to run. She asked whether the sons would live. When he said no, she nodded once and began carrying messages in the hems of aprons and the folds of head wrap cloth. The old healer on the estate, a woman called Benna, kept her herb knowledge arranged in two worlds, one for open survival, one for hidden war. The first world held roots for fever, leaves for swelling, bark for worms, salves for burns. The second held powders that cramped a drinker's gut, bitter mash that slowed dogs, and seeds that brought on heavy sleep in men who believed themselves invulnerable. White people mocked her as superstitious. That contempt was a kind of protection. A one-eyed cartman named Cuff had driven loads between plantations for years and knew the roads beyond Blackwater better than any mapmaker who had ever sat dry in town. He knew where a horse would bog to the belly after rain. He knew which bridge planks had rotted underneath. He knew which patrol road flooded first when the sky opened over the marsh. A child named Josiah, small enough to disappear under stairs and between pilings, knew the underside of the big house better than any carpenter. The plantation that thought it owned everybody's bodies had already begun feeding information into its own grave. Then came Amani. She was 16, maybe 17, with a fever she had hidden for 2 days, because hiding weakness was often the only way to survive long enough to recover from it. The late summer heat had laid itself over the rice fields like wet cloth. Insects came in clouds. Mud sucked at ankles with every step. Amani faltered in the lower trunk while setting seedlings and folded into the water. Not in defiance, in collapse. He rode over cursing before his horse had even settled. He ordered her up. She tried. Her legs gave out. He kicked her in the ribs. She coughed blood into the floodwater. The whole line had gone silent by then. Everyone knew the shape of what was coming. Mercer took his whip to her where she lay. He beat her in front of the field line, beat her while her mother screamed from the next row, beat her after she stopped trying to rise, beat her until the rice water around her turned pink with blood and mud. Then he ordered 2 men to drag her to the embankment and leave her there until dark as instruction. Kofi stood 10 paces away with a planting blade in his hand and did not move. That was not cowardice. It was the hardest kind of waiting. That night, after the cabins fell quiet, he walked alone to where Amani's body lay wrapped in shadow near the trunk wall. One of her hands was clenched so tight he had to work each finger open. Inside was a strip of cloth from her head wrap, twisted in her palm as if she had held on to the last tender thing left to her. Kofi looked past the flooded rows toward the lit windows of the big house, where men who had done this were eating, drinking, breathing, and planning another day like it. Something inside him went still. Not numb, not broken. Exact. He understood then that Blackwater House was not a place where mercy might someday be found under enough obedience. It was a machine. It transformed fear into labor, labor into profit, and profit into the right to inflict more fear. To show mercy to such a machine was to offer your own neck back to it. When he returned to the quarters, Ben was waiting at the corner where the dark held deepest. Kofi said very calmly, "No man sleeping in that house deserves another sunrise." Ben looked at him for a long time, then answered, "Then we stop surviving it and start ending it." That was the hour the estate began to die. After that, Kofi no longer merely observed the plantation. He divided it. Yard, house, stable, dogs, gate, bell, watch, powder, fire, escape roads, weak boards, strong men, unsafe men, broken men, children to hide, women who must not be left near the house once the killing started. He trusted slowly because fear makes tongues loose and grief makes brave people foolish. One stable hand named Isaiah had learned to live by carrying scraps of information to white ears in exchange for favor. Men like that could ruin a rising before it breathed, so the circle took shape in layers. Only the core knew the whole plan. Others only knew a signal, a route, a task, a time to move. The white men on Blackwater believed Africans could not form one will because they came from different peoples and tongues. Suffering taught them a new language. It lived in the number of taps against a hoe blade, in where a basket was set down, whether a head wrap knot sat left or right, in how long someone paused before answering a question under watch. 2 taps meant wait, 3 meant danger. A line of ash by the smokehouse wall meant the North Patrol had changed route. A piece of indigo cloth tied low near the canebrake meant a burial ground meeting after moonrise. Kofi used storm damage and repair tasks as cover to widen his map. He learned the shortest dark route from the quarters to the gun room. He learned how to jam the cabinet hinge with a shaving of metal so it would seize under panic. He learned which stable boards could be pulled loose without squeal. He learned that kitchen ash mixed with crushed pepper would blind dogs and men alike for the seconds that mattered. He learned the back kitchen latch could be lifted from outside with a thin strip of bent iron. He learned that boiling indigo liquor and lamp oil were both weapons if used where surprise worked first. He learned the bell beam above the yard had rot in one side and would drop clean if cut right. These were not random details. They were the skeleton of judgment. Still, Kofi knew planning alone could not carry men through the moment blood actually started. The spirit had to be made ready too, not through loud speeches. Loud speeches feed the gallows. He did it through story. He reminded boys in the cabins that the world had once held villages where men fought invaders and won by patience rather than size. He reminded mothers that a child whispered a true name in the dark was still carrying a kingdom no ledger could erase. Ben taught footwork under the guise of old dance patterns. Benna taught the young which roots cured fever and which ones belonged to a different use entirely. Amma told women what to hide, what to keep near, and where to move with children after the second signal. Cuff quietly marked marsh roads and floodable exits. Josiah crawled under porches, through storage gaps, beneath the service corridor, learning the underside of white comfort by touch. The estate was no longer merely suffering together. It was becoming dangerous. Then Blackwater took Omari. He was 13, perhaps younger, assigned to the indigo works where the vats smoked under foul heat and chemical sting. He had a cut on one shin that had gone angry and swollen, but nobody relieved him. Near dusk, dizzy and limping, He stumbled carrying a slop bucket beside one of the steeping pits. The bucket slid. He reached wrong. His arm plunged into the scalding blue liquor to the elbow. His scream cut through the yard like something being killed alive. Flesh peeled almost at once. Instead of stopping the line, Silas Vane struck him across the face for carelessness and ordered him dragged clear so the vat work could continue. Omari's mother broke from the line to reach him. Mercer held her back. Silas laughed. Kofi saw all of it and came closer than he ever had to destroying everything before it was ready. His hand closed so hard around the work knife at his side that the blade bit his own palm. Another heartbeat, and he would have opened Silas from throat to ribs in front of every lantern on the yard. Ben passed behind him in that exact moment and pressed 2 fingers once into the center of Kofi's back. Not comfort, command. Not now. Kofi stood rigid while Omari's screams turned to weak animal sounds in the dust, and he learned the harshest law of revenge. Strike too early, and you kill one man. Wait long enough, and you can kill the disease. That night, the Corps gathered at the old burial patch beyond the far rice, where crooked shells and rotted markers sank into root and moss. Amma came first, then Ben, then Cuff, then Benna, carrying a small cloth bundle that smelled bitter and sharp. Then Josiah, barefoot and watchful. No one wasted words. They all knew the line had been crossed days earlier. Omari had only burned the truth brighter. Amma said the master would host 2 river traders within 10 days. That meant late drinking, vanity, loosened routine, extra kitchen motion, and men who would not know the house the way its own people did. Cuff said storm weather was pushing inland, and once the roads took enough rain, riders would lose speed before they reached the main highway. Benna opened her bundle. Inside were roots, seeds, and powders enough to deaden dogs, cramp a watchman, and slow any man foolish enough to drink from the wrong bottle. Josiah said he could reach the underside of the rear corridor and lift the service hatch from below. Kofi listened to each piece and felt not hope, because hope was too soft for what had to be done, but certainty. The house had already entered the part of dying where it still looked alive to itself. He looked from face to face in the moonless dark. They were not soldiers in any uniform a white chronicler would honor. They were a washwoman, a healer, a cartman, a child, an old drummer, a field hand with scars under fresh scars. Yet he had never seen anything more formidable. From this night, he told them, we stop thinking like the hunted. We become the fear in their walls. No one argued. After that, preparation accelerated without ever appearing to. The dogs got used to scraps touched by Benna's mixtures, so the final dose would not alarm them. Extra hatchets vanished from the stable one at a time and reappeared under feed sacks. A broken hinge near the smokehouse was left broken on purpose because it made one route easier in the dark. Josiah tucked a small iron shaving near the firearm cabinet hinge during a cleaning errand under the house. Amma loosened a back kitchen bolt, half a finger width more each night, so no sudden change would be noticed. Cuff moved a cart axle toward the gate road under cover of routine repair. Ben timed the watch rotation by stars and rain. Kofi made note of who would panic, who would freeze, and who might need direct orders once blood started. He also decided who had to die first. Silas, because he was violent and reckless. The North Watch, because alarm was death. Mercer, because fear ran through him and made him cruelly efficient. The bookkeeper, because ledgers and lists helped the state understand what happened. Vane and Nathaniel, because the house was not merely shelter, but symbol. Any guest or driver who raised a weapon, because the machine had many hands. Isaiah, if he talked. Kofi did not need everybody on the estate to kill. He needed enough people to hold discipline longer than the whites expected. Then, finally, Blackwater handed him the night. The storm had been crouching all afternoon over the marsh, the sky swollen purple-gray, the air thick enough that even standing still made a shirt cling. By sunset, lanterns were already lit in the big house. Master Elias Vane had 2 traders to supper, men soft with river profit and distance, the kind who could discuss acreage, crop yield, breeding stock, and flogging methods over roast meat without losing appetite. Vane liked to perform mastery for guests. That evening, before they sat to eat, he had 3 men dragged to the yard and whipped for slow work in front of the visitors. One had a split foot. One had fever. The guests laughed anyway. That was the last easy laughter Blackwater heard from white throats. Beyond the house light, the estate looked ordinary. A woman crossed the yard with a basin. A boy carried kindling. The stables settled. The quarters dimmed. The indigo fires banked low. Nothing in those motions would have alarmed a careless eye. That was the genius of the plan. It began inside normal. Before dark, Benna's mixtures had gone into dog scraps and a shared jug. By full night, one watchman was fighting stomach cramps behind the shed. The other could barely keep his head upright against the north fence. The dogs had stopped barking at every shift in the dark. Amma made her final pass through the hallway carrying folded linen and warm water. She watched Vane sink deeper into rum. She watched Nathaniel boast. She watched one trader pull off his boots and ask whether any girl on the estate had been set aside for company. She kept her face empty. In the pantry, she paused long enough to ease the back bolt looser still. Then she vanished into service dark. Under the rear porch, Josiah moved through packed earth and beam shadow like a rat born with purpose. He knew which plank would lift, which nail would hold, where to place a hand to avoid sound. Above him, chairs scraped, men drank, and silver touched plates. He nudged open the service hatch, slid into the corridor, crossed to the firearm cabinet, and fixed the iron shaving deeper into the hinge seam. Not stop the cabinet forever. It only had to stop it long enough. In the quarters, nobody slept. Mothers held children close and repeated the rule: whatever noise comes, stay low until the second signal. Old people sat upright against walls, not praying for rescue, but waiting to hear what history sounded like when it finally answered. Ben positioned the stablemen by rope, hatchets, and lamp oil hidden under feed sacks days earlier. Cuff waited near the gate road with 2 others and the heavy cartwheel already loosened for drag. Benna crouched by the curing shed with cloth wraps and powders. Amma stepped out from the house shadows and found Kofi standing beside the smokehouse where rain had just begun to spit into the dirt. Lightning flashed once over the marsh. For an instant, the whole estate appeared in hard white outline. The house, the post, the vats, the quarters, the live oaks bent over mud, the flooded trunks, the place where too many people had been made to kneel. Kofi thought of Amani in the water, Omari in the dust, every unnamed woman cornered by lantern light, every child born under another person's ledger mark, every grave without a name. Then he gave the first signal. Not a shout, a low owl call from beside the smokehouse, ordinary enough that a white man might have smiled at the weather and thought no more of it. Silas Vane died first. Half drunk and angry from losing at cards, he had stepped out behind the kitchen to piss into the rain. One hand came over his mouth from behind. A sharpened field blade went under his jaw and up into the brain. He jerked once, hard, then sagged. Kofi held him upright long enough to keep him from kicking a bucket or striking the wall. Amma helped drag the body into shadow beside the rear step. No speech, no ceremony. One son gone. At the north fence, Ben looped a neckcloth around the drowsing watchman and pulled until the cartilage gave. The second man came around the shed, half bent with cramps, and only had time to see movement before a hatchet split his face open from brow to teeth. No alarm, no musket fired. The estate's outer hearing was gone. Inside the house, Vane was midway through one of his favorite stories, laughing about a runaway he had once hung by the wrists until the brute remembered his place when a crash sounded in the rear corridor. He rose irritated, not afraid. One trader made a joke about kitchen rats wearing boots. Then the back door burst inward, and Ben crossed the threshold with blood dark on his forearms. He put a cleaver through the first trader's throat before the man had fully turned in his chair. The second lunged toward the sideboard where he had seen a pistol laid earlier. Amma threw a kettle of near-boiling wash water into his face from the hall, screaming and clutching at skin that had already begun to blister away. Vane roared and lunged for the gun cabinet. The hinge jammed. He yanked once, twice, cursed, then turned and found Kofi already in front of him. For the first time since the day of sale, master and enslaved man looked at one another without the usual stage furniture of the plantation between them. No steward, no post, no mounted horse, no field line, only breath, shock, and the sudden arrival of truth. Vane knew him, not fully, not humanly, but enough to register that the thing he had always treated as property was now deciding whether he lived. "You," Vane said. Kofi answered with a butcher hook driven through the meat of his shoulder, hurling him backward across the dining table in a crash of plates, bone, and glass. Nathaniel came off the stair landing with a fireplace poker, and might have struck Kofi clean across the skull if Amma had not rammed a carving fork into the side of his neck. He fell, choking. Ben smashed his head against the stair rail until wood cracked. The house ceased, in that instant, to be a house. It became a court. Outside, the yard erupted into controlled violence. Stable hands cut the horses loose to create confusion and noise. Cuff and two others dragged the loaded cart across the gate road, pinning the exit in mud. The bookkeeper, Mr. Hales, stumbled from his office in a nightshirt clutching papers and a pistol, slipped in rain, got one shot off blind into the dark, and disappeared under hose before he could rise. Ledger pages plastered themselves to mud like wet leaves. A driver named Pritchard, notorious for beating children for sport, made it almost to the mule pen before Benna's ash and pepper pouch burst in his eyes. He dropped his lantern and walked screaming into a mallet that shattered his jaw. They tied him to the whipping post he had used on so many others and left him there, moaning red into the storm while the hunt continued. This was not chaos. That is what later white records needed it to be. Chaos is easier to dismiss than competence. But Blackwater's dead were not taken at random. Every team had a route. Every target had a priority. Every delay had been anticipated as best the captives could manage. Children stayed hidden. Women with infants moved where Amma had told them. Men who had not been trusted with the full plan still knew enough to carry bodies clear, block paths, guard the quarter lanes, or wait for orders after the second signal. What moved across Blackwater that night was not frenzy. It was memory with sequence. One overseer hid in the smokehouse until Josiah heard him breathing through the boards. They dragged him out by his ankles. He swore he had never whipped anyone, swore he would say nothing, swore he had a wife. No one there had been spared because a white man had a wife. He died face down in churned mud under a corn knife. Another clerk tried for the East Rice Road, but rain had already deepened the ditches. Cuff knew every rise and hollow. They found the clerk by sound before they saw him and left him in the reeds for dawn. Inside the front hall, Vane still lived, badly. Bleeding from shoulder and face, one leg twisted under him, breath coming wet. Yet even there, on his own floorboards, he seemed less frightened than bewildered. Men like him can imagine death by fever, accident, war, or God. They cannot imagine being brought low by the people whose obedience they mistook for nature. They'll hunt every one of you, he spat through blood. They'll hang your children. Kofi crouched beside him. Rain blew through the open door and darkened the floor between them. Voices rose from the yard, shouts, feet, a horse kicking somewhere loose in the storm. From deeper in the house came the broken crying of the trader whose face Amma had scalded. "You never heard us," Kofi said. Vane frowned. He truly did not understand. That was the revelation. He had ruled a world he had never seen. He knew output, acreage, market price, breeding rate, punishment effect. He had never known the mines moving beneath his roof, never known how carefully the people around him had measured him back. Kofi took the branding iron from beside the hearth where kitchen heat had kept it warm. He held it where Vane could see. "This house learned our pain," he said. "Tonight, it learns yours." The second signal cut through the storm then, a long, hard whistle from Ben in the yard. Ground secure. No armed white men left alive. No rider clear of the gate. No more reason to move quietly. The hallway began to fill. Amma stood in one doorway with blood on her sleeve and no softness left in her eyes. Ben came in, breathing hard, shoulders wet, one hand wrapped around a cleaver black to the handle. A woman from the quarters whispered, "Remember Imani." Someone behind her said, "Remember Omari." Another voice, low and shaking with rage, said the name of a daughter taken by Nathaniel. Then Benaiah. Then Ruth. Then the child who had died in fever because Mercer denied medicine. Then a husband sold after striking back. Then a mother whipped while nursing. Then another. Then another. The house filled with the dead. Vane began to shake, not from cold, from the realization that he was no longer facing one man in a hallway. He was facing the sum of what he had built. No quick death was offered to him. When at last they carried what remained of Elias Vane to the front gate before dawn and fixed him there for the road to see, the display was not random sadism. It was message. The plantation had taught everyone around it that power only listens when written in flesh. So flesh became the final sentence. Pritchard was still tied to the whipping post in the yard, trying to beg through his ruined jaw. Kofi walked out into the rain and looked up at the wood darkened by years of other people's blood. "This post has eaten enough of us," he said. Then he nodded. Lamp oil ran down the grain. Flame climbed. Thunder swallowed the screaming. By first light, Blackwater House no longer resembled a plantation. Dogs lay where they had fallen. The yard was scattered with broken furniture, dropped tools, wrecked ledgers, bodies, hats, shattered glass, and rainwater gone pink, then brown, in the dirt. Smoke moved up into a white morning. Windows stared hollow from the big house. In the distance, the rice fields looked almost peaceful under mist, as if they had not spent years swallowing labor and screams. Kofi stood in the center of the yard, soaked in rain and blood, and looked not triumphant, but emptied out. Revenge does not arrive singing. It arrives with exhaustion, shaking hands, and the knowledge that whatever comes next will demand a new kind of hardness. Killing the estate did not end the world that had built it. It only tore a hole in that world wide enough for the living to move through. Before the first outside wagon reached the lane, before county men or militia could measure the dead and begin manufacturing lies, Kofi turned from the house and led the survivors toward the marsh paths Cuff had marked in his head. Some would split for the inland swamps. Some would move toward river routes. Some would vanish into free black settlements if they could reach them. Some would be taken later. Some would die before winter. History is cruel enough to deny clean endings even after righteous nights. But Blackwater House itself was finished. The first white men to arrive after sunrise were haulers from a road station, expecting to collect indigo and rice. What they found instead was a property silenced by judgment. They saw a vein at the gate and went pale. They saw the burned whipping post, the dead dogs, the broken hall, the bodies in the yard, and the papers melting into mud. One later swore the whole place felt haunted before he even understood what he was seeing. Another said the enslaved must have gone mad all at once. That, of course, was the lie. Madness does not jam a gun cabinet in advance. Madness does not drug the dogs before dark. Madness does not time the patrol rotation, block the gate road, coordinate routes, choose kill order, or move children by signal. No. What happened at Blackwater House was intelligence forced underground for too long, and then released with purpose. Official correspondents tried to clean the story immediately. The dead were rendered respectable in ink. The captives became insurgents, savages, criminal Negroes, fanatics. The years of rape, flogging, sale, theft, and mutilation that made the uprising inevitable were flattened into one phrase: unprovoked barbarity. Because empire has always preferred its own violence to look administrative, and the violence of the oppressed to look irrational. But rumor kept slipping past paper. Road hands told the story one way, field hands another. Boatmen widened it further. Some said the leader was a giant who could move through cane without sound. Some claimed he had drowned years earlier and returned only to collect names. Some called him the marsh judge. Others called him the one who listened. In time, the fragments hardened into something half history, half warning. Masters used the story to frighten themselves at supper. Enslaved people used it differently, not as fantasy, as proof. Proof that the plantation was not all-seeing. Proof that white routine could be studied, mapped, and broken. Proof that memory survived crossing water. Proof that the people worked half to death in mud and heat were still capable of coordination, patience, and war. No court ever recorded Kofi's true name. No ledger admitted what Blackwater had done to deserve its end. No monument marked the women whose suffering helped design the fall. No county archive preserved the intelligence of the old drummer, the washwoman, the healer, the cartman, the child beneath the floorboards. That is why stories like this matter. Because the archive tends to remember plantations as property and uprisings as disruption. It rarely remembers the minds that had to stay alive inside hell long enough to dismantle it. Somewhere under Carolina earth, beneath roots and flood and years of deliberate forgetting, there are still people with no stones over them who helped erase a house built on their backs. They were never meant to be remembered as strategists, never meant to be remembered as witnesses, never meant to be remembered at all. And yet here they are, in the broken gate, in the jammed hinge, in the dead dogs, in the burned post. In the silence after dawn, when the masters finally understood that terror had changed owners for one night. That was the truth Blackwater House could not survive. And that is why the road around that place kept its hush for years after. Why laborers crossed themselves near the old marsh turn. Why mothers lowered their voices when they spoke of a house that vanished before the sun was fully up. Because every system built on dehumanizing other human beings carries the same fatal blindness. Sooner or later, it forgets the people under it are still thinking. And when thought, memory, and rage finally lock together, the house goes dark.